Welcome, welcome, everyone. So we'll get into my questions. I won't just randomly ask Ryan about romance games the entire time we have him. I'll save that for when we get to hang out at GDC. But Ryan does have an immense amount of experience to share with everyone. He's familiar with Dorian. He did come to our workshop at GDC and he's gotten to see the engine and stuff like that. And I think, it's pretty cool for you guys as creators in our community who might not have gotten a chance to talk to someone like Ryan who has so much experience. So we're going to ask a few questions, but we'll also save some time for later in the session for you to ask your own questions as well. I know we kind of high level already started looking into this, or talking about it, but can you give the high level, of what your experience is? What's your background? How did you even get into games in the first place, Ryan?
Yeah. So I went to college and got a creative writing degree because I wanted to be a writer. I didn't think it was going to go anywhere or that I could do anything with it, whoever makes money with a creative writing degree.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Um,
also have a creative writing degree. Yeah.
So yeah, and it just happened that a friend of mine was working at LucasArts doing, the adventure games and the Star Wars games, and they needed testers. And so I was like, oh yeah, I could do that for a while. I could test video games, and it would, twist my arm. Gradually, I just got more embedded in that company and I started doing design work for them. And then I became a game designer. And then they were like, oh, we need some dialogue over here. We need some menu text. Can you write that? Because you're a writer. And I was like, yeah. And then that sort of grew and grew and grew. And yeah, and I realized that there's a huge potential for storytelling in video games. And even at that point where games are kind of primitive, you could still tell kind of cool stories and come up with interesting characters and give players choices inside of the narrative. That was always fun and interesting to do. And obviously it's something people really love because here we are, we're still doing it, and all these years later. And LucasArts is where I got to know the guys who founded Telltale. And so that was my bridge to them later on in my career when they founded Telltale. And I joined up with Telltale just as they were putting together the first Walking Dead. So the series hasn't come out yet. Nobody knows about Walking Dead except for people who are like, oh yeah, the comic. This is pre-TV show, all that stuff. Yeah, it was all based on the comic book, and they were trying to put it together and figure it out. And I joined that team and I helped them. One of the things I did that, for better for worse, was the guy who came up with Clementine will remember that text.
That's so iconic. I mean, I feel like everyone who does
It's a
any
meme. Yeah.
storytelling that is the thing that you think of. I don't even think I knew that you were the person who came up with that. That's amazing.
At that point the game didn't have that anywhere and people really liked the game, but they were like, I don't know I don't know if my choices are doing anything or what's the point of making the narrative choices because they were somewhat subtle. And so coming from a game design background where I was used to making guns and things that explode and you need really good player feedback, I was like, oh, we should have narrative feedback. That should be a thing. That's how that little piece of text got written.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great segue into what we want to talk about because you've had the chance to work on some of the biggest IPs that exist out in the world. And you've also, I know, published a linear novel yourself. So can you speak about the difference between writing linear content and then writing something that you are taking from a defined story and adapting into interactive? What are the differences there for you?
Taking an IP and adapting it is really about understanding the rules of that world, most of all. Once you understand the storytelling techniques of that world, you have to dig a little bit deeper than, obviously you need to know the lore and the characters and all the surface level stuff, but you also need to know what kinds of stories get told in that world and how you can either write stories that are very similar, or if you're going to go your own way, understand at least what you're working against. And so what you might have to overcome if you're defying the expectation of the person who's playing it. Whereas, when you're writing your own things, you're responsible for all that work up front, where you have to understand your own world and your own storytelling, tone and technique and all that. That can be really freeing, or it can be crushing when you're it's too hard to come up with it all.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it's a bit crazy.
For you, like as you've worked in linear and interactive, I think there's a lot of people in this call right now who probably have most experience from maybe they've tried to write a novel, they've written some fan fiction, they've written a lot of like linear projects. Like what do you view as like the core differences between like writing interactive and writing linear, and that like a linear writer would need to know to write interactive?
Number one thing is when you're writing for an interactive, you have to think about the player's journey first, as opposed to when you're writing a linear thing, you're thinking about your ability as an author to pace a story or introduce elements or characters and you're taking them on a journey. But when you're thinking interactively, as you're writing, you really have to like almost imagine someone sitting across the table from you. Like if you do role-playing games, you'll be very familiar with this, like kind of cooperative storytelling. But if you don't, just imagine somebody who doesn't know the story you're trying to tell sitting across from you, and they're asking you questions like, why is that person saying that? Or what if I don't want to do that? Or what if, can I ask him this? Can I ask him that? So you have to have that imaginary person in your head, because it really set you up better to make a story that will be much more inherently playable, where you'll have natural places where in the story where you're like, okay, now I'm gonna ask this imaginary person what they want to do, instead of just like when you're writing linear, you're forging ahead in a lot of ways, like your own path. And you're
Yeah.
like, I'm gonna take you on a journey and you're gonna follow behind me. And that's a really different way to think about writing.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite writing books is with Stephen King's book on writing, and he has that great phrase where he says, "Kill your darlings." And I feel like when you go to interactive from linear, it's like an exercise in killing your darlings, because you have the picture of the story as you want it to happen, but in interactive, you have to allow your player to be the actual driver of that story. And it's like almost emotional at times, because you have to release these things that you really want to happen just so that they can actually control what happens. But yeah, so I mean, you have all this experience, of course, with like experimenting with new creative ideas at Telltale. You guys were really like paving the way for other storytellers. But I want to hear about like, as you look back at your time on Telltale, what do you think your biggest creative mistakes are that you would never want to repeat now, and that you wish you could have avoided at the time? Yeah.
The number one is really funny, and I'm not just saying this because I'm like we're talking about Dorian, but not having any little real romance in the games. Like romance was such a side like quest for us. We're like, oh yeah, well, I guess you could kind of romance this person, but I would never approach it that way again. I would very much be like, no, these are a pretty big part of the story for a lot of these interactive pieces. And it's such a rich like role-playing space too, where people often ask me like, how do you build these games so that they don't get too big and branch all over the place? And a lot of the tricks you have to use are to like create role-playing spaces that feel kind of branchy, but they don't end up in like wildly different places. And romance is really good for that, because you can go, if you're on a road trip from like California to New York with someone, you'll see the same sights, but the way that you get there, you could either be fighting with them, you could be romancing them, you could be romancing and fighting. But in terms of like the practical issues of what sets do I need to build, or what backgrounds do I need to draw, or how much art or whatever, it's like going to be virtually the same.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
I think also it's like romance builds a lot of investment off the bat. Like we talk a lot about how, I might not be able to access the concept of like the orc army is coming toward me right now, and I have the elven king and stuff, but like most people know what it feels like to have just been dumped or something like that, right? So it's very
yeah.
easy to access.
Totally. And I think there's a couple of stories on Dorian, including some of yours, that do such a great job of plunging you in like really quickly into a kind of a hot situation where the emotions you feel are very relatable very quickly. So like, yeah, you do not have to do like a big lore dump, like this
Yeah.
is the world and the last 12,000 years of history and da da da. You can just be like, I'm in front of a shark god who's gonna eat me, and then suddenly he's nice to me, and you're like, oh, like what's going on here? And he's kind of hot. So stuff like that. I think like I I really love the format of Dorian because it puts you like right there. And the relatable emotions, like you say, it's like that investment where you want to come back, and you're like 4 or 5 clicks in and you're like, I already know kind of what's going on and I'm interested to see where it's going.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, romance is so good for that.
Yeah. Any other things for you, creative mistakes you feel like you wouldn't want to repeat from Telltale days?
To me, sort of dumb stuff, like where, like in the Game of Thrones game, we really loved Ramsay Bolton. I don't know if you've all seen like Game of Thrones, but like Ramsay is an amazing character. He's so like evil and unpredictable. He's really fun to bring into a story, but he has plot armor. So we loved him and we would bring him in, and then we'd kind of be like, wow, well, what are we gonna do with him? Like, what do we do with him? And he just have to like come into the story, be really mean, and then leave. So creative mistakes like that, where I would go, oh, I wouldn't do that again, just like because of what I know now. But in terms of big stuff, like yeah, that like more romance, and then more. I wish we'd experimented more with other formats. We kind of tried, but those experiments never really hit like our main game. But even in, I don't know, it was 2016 or whatever, I was looking around at mobile and seeing like, okay, mobile storytelling is very condensed, very accessible for a lot of people. And I wish that we could have done something there, but we just didn't have. I mean, we were kind of a bootstrap company, so it was like we never had the time or money to go there. But I wish we had.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think one of the biggest benefits that our creators on Dorian, a lot of the people in this call right now are probably planning to pitch the Legends program, which you're judging for. And the fact that they can put these games together in like, I think an hour to pitch a game on Dorian compared to however, I don't know how long it took to make an episode of something on Telltale, I'm
Oh
sure.
my God. Yeah, it's crazy. And like when people ask me like how do I get started in games, I always point them at like Twine and Dorian, because the interface is so simple and it can get you up and running, and you can like click test your story and see like, do I even have something
Yeah.
in a matter like a half an hour. Like we did that. I don't even know how long was that workshop, like
I think you were
a
creating
couple
for about an
hours.
hour and a half, and then you were live streamed by a TikToker with millions of followers within
Yeah,
15 minutes. Yeah.
I mean, it's such a rush, and like I feel like anyone can do that, where you just like the tool's super easy to use. Yeah, normally there's such a massive barrier to getting into games. Like, well, you need a studio, or you need, you know what I mean? Like, you need $1 million of investment. Like, so yeah, yeah. And I just, yeah.
Let's say if you were a writer or a comic artist who was like, you have a linear property, maybe you have your novel or you have your web comic, and you wanted to turn it into a game today, how would you start to like set up yourself up for success?
Games lend themselves like sort of like episodic TV. They lend themselves to characters. So I would go through and I would find like what are my character dynamics that are really interesting, and less like, do I have a really interesting like plot thread that, like, you know how you were saying kill your darlings, like you should be prepared to go through and kill your darlings, and
Yeah.
one of your darlings might be like, I have a very intricate plot that like requires you to go A to B to C, and then in order to work, like forget that. Like
Yeah.
like look at your characters. Do you have an interesting suite of characters who are kind of, would each one be interesting to spend some time with? Or like, yep, that I do have like a good, what do they call that, ensemble kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
like approach to storytelling. I would look at your characters and say, which ones could I spend an hour with and like have an
Yeah.
interesting conversation or something?
Do you feel like, is there some way you would estimate like which characters you would start with and like focus on first? Like, how do you evaluate whether a character is interesting for your players?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so like with Ramsey as the
Yeah.
example, like somebody who's evil, we love, right? Like the morally gray villain. Actually, there's nothing morally gray about Ramsey Bolton, but but we love a good villain because we feel like we can turn them, and or if you don't end up turning them, then they will take you somewhere that's going to be scary and interesting, and like stuff will happen. It can be often really hard to start with like a straight up vanilla hero, because you're like, I already know what this person's capable of.
Almost like you need a fire starter, someone who's going to do something dramatic that's going to push the story forward. Relevant one for the creators who are watching. Like, I know we know that enemies to lovers works super well, but like certainly characters that create conflict is a great way to start with. Any other things, like, would you think, or do you think there's anything they would want to look at from a linear, like in terms of strategy for designing choices or things like that? Like, would you be looking at, for example, like world building elements that they could use to inform the kinds of choices they are going to design in their game?
I've noticed the really successful ones on Dorian and elsewhere are like really tropey. And like tropes being a very good thing to me. Like tropes kind of help tell you as the player or the reader, like where you are immediately. So if you can select tropes like, yeah, like I have to save the child, or I have to like do that, or we have to like the enemies to lovers, or we're stuck together, we're handcuffed together on a quest, kind of
Yeah.
thing, like where you pretty immediately understand like what the setup is, when you pretty immediately understand like this is a situation that must be resolved one way or another. But the resolution um doesn't matter so much. It's like we know we have to get out of the situation, but we don't necessarily need to do it one way or the other, because that allows you to create the story where the player has a lot of agency about how they're going to go about what they're doing. Yeah, that would be what I would start with.
I mean, I think for our creators, like that's something that we talk a lot about is the concept of creating clear player goal. Like I need to
Mhm.
know exactly what I'm trying to accomplish, especially from the beginning. So what I'm hearing from you is that's definitely like having some sort of very easy to grasp scenario that you drop me into, and it's like I know what I'm trying to accomplish in this immediate moment is the big one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And having that structurally, if you build a story where, say, after the first 10 minutes, you're able to like have a character state that, or even if you have to use that narrator interface to kind of tell you like what your goal is, I think that's really also nice too. If you guys have ever seen like TV shows that have a cold open, that can often be an interesting way to think about like what you're doing, where the end of that cold open will help you understand like, oh, this is the greater like world I'm in.
Yeah.
Whereas the cold open might be kind of a small contained piece of that. You're like, oh, I'm just like between two characters that are arguing about something. But then like the last beat like opens up and you go, oh, we're arguing because we're stuck in this world and we need to get off the planet before it explodes, or like what, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Um, when you're thinking about like a linear to interactive adaptation, what do you think are like the most common reasons for failures or common pitfalls that people have done before?
Definitely trying to force your vision as the author of like how this all needs to go onto the player, when they just might not be along for the ride. They might be like, no, I wasn't compelled by, the author's vision of how it needed to be, and I wanted my own path and it was not offered. um that would be, I think, the number one pitfall. Or trying to tell the story too much like a novel or something, where you're like, I'm gonna have all these reveals. Like I've seen people do this, where it's like surprise after surprise. And in a TV show that can work really well, but as a game, that can be really disorienting. Like a couple of reveals is cool, but like, don't try to structure, if your novel is like a whole series of plot twists that you're like, oh, it's really interesting, and I'm always like keeping the reader on their toes. As a novel, that's really cool, and as a TV show it's really cool, but when you're playing, you're like, I want to have some more like sense of my control. Like I
Mm,
want to have some sense like I'm a bit in control. And if you keep doing like, whoops, we pulled the rug out again, you're like, oh well, I guess I really don't know where this story is going or what the heck is going on. So
yeah.
beware
Yeah.
of that.
In linear, I think a lot of action is powered by things that happen to the protagonist. And in interactive, we want the protagonist to being the doing the things to other people. And so that's the hardest thing.
Yeah.
Like one of the things we often like, I think our creators wonder about is like inciting events. How much can it be something that is like, I'm being thrown into the scenario and this stuff is happening to me and I'm reacting to that. Like, can you speak on like, do you think there's a big difference in the types of inciting events you can have in interactive versus linear, or does that matter?
Yeah, I mean, like Marrying the Villain and Sharkbait both have like almost instantaneous, like a thing happened to me, I'm being forced into a situation, but then the flip to like, okay, now it's your job to like manage it and try to figure out how you're going to get out of it. Like
Yeah.
that's the perfect ratio for me. It's like, yeah, if you get dropped in the volcano, that's interesting. But then almost immediately, like, give your players some tools to like help themselves out, or at least try like to mitigate the damage. And I think you said it really well. It's like things that happen to the main character work well in novels. Less so in TV, but you can still have an observer character who's very much like I'm observing the story about a bunch of other crazy people. But when you're thinking about interactive, you want to make the main character, the protagonist, um, responsible for a lot of the banana stuff that's going on, because that's fun. Like it's fun to like not let them knock down the dominoes and see what happens and play
Yeah.
that out.
Yeah, and I think like the key to interactive as well is like in a linear, you can write a really dark linear novel where a character is just experiencing all these horrible things that are happening to them. But especially in our format on Dorian, it's like you want to make it that I'm resolving this problem, but I'm also getting chances to do it in varied ways that are the most fun possible. So it's not even like it's that's a special art, I think, for a lot of our creators who might be coming from writing linear, where you can almost afford to have some scenes that are a little more lackluster because people are on the rails and they're going to go through that train stop no matter what. But on Dorian, you got to keep them on the train chugging forward and going to the next choice. So it has to be much more fun for them. This is a kind of fun question we have for you. So, was there anything that you designed before that had an unexpected or shocking reaction from the fans, and how were you able to handle that?
I'm trying to, there was one that was more like funny than anything. But there's a scene in Wolf Among Us that I really love where Bigby is the main character and he's the sheriff of Fabletown. So all the fables are like, if you're not familiar with the IP, they're all like fables in exile. So you got like Snow White is there, the Big Bad Wolf is there, the Woodsman, Little Red Riding Hood. They're all like stuck in New York City, and Bigby's the sheriff trying to keep them all in line. And at one point, he's talking to the woodsman who's super drunk at a bar, and Woodsman's giving him this sob story. And one thing that you can do if you're Bigby is like be a jerk about it. And so we put this choice up that I wrote that said glass him. If you know, if you know like pub culture or anything, glassing somebody's like hitting them over the head with a glass, or like just you're starting a fight basically. And I just thought that'd be a funny way to cut off like a character who's monologuing and monologuing and monologuing.
Yeah.
Um, so I thought that meaning was super clear, but I found out later that a bunch of players who weren't familiar with that term thought that meant like
Cheers.
toast him, or like, yeah, like they thought they were going to be nice, and then the exact opposite happened. It just kind of makes me laugh. Like it doesn't ruin the game, and it doesn't like ultimately like really screw up anything. But I just so that's always like funny to me. Of like, oh yeah, I didn't really think about that. But people were like, oh yeah, I'll toast him. Like, hey buddy, everything's going well. And bam, yeah.
Oh,
Uh,
that's amazing. I remember that starts the fight scene, right? Or is there a fight scene? Like there's a brawl in Wolf
there's
Among
a brawl. Yeah, you get to the
Yeah.
brawl. Yeah, you get to the brawl earlier if you do
Oh,
that. But like, yeah.
I do remember that because I think I was very bad at playing that sequence. I'm like, I'm really good at the flirting options, less good at the fighting in video games overall. Um,
Yeah.
Anything else that you had like a kind of unexpected reaction to as you were creating?
I think any unexpected reactions. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Yeah. So at the end of Game of Thrones, we did a choice. This is all spoilers, but like the game's been out for a while. Yeah.
Yeah.
So um there's a spoiler choice like by episode 5 where you have to pick between these two brothers, and you've been playing from both sides. You've been playing one brother who's trying to get home, and then the other brother who is trying to save the family, home and castle, whatever. And then at one point we finagled it so it's like it's kind of a do or die thing. Like one of them's gonna die and the other one's gonna save him, but one of
Yeah.
these characters is gonna die. And people really, I thought they would have fun making that choice, and they were like paralyzed. They're like, I don't know, I can't, I don't, I thought I knew. And then we got a lot of feedback that it was just like that's one of the hardest choices we ever put in the game.
Yeah.
Whereas to me, it was so, I just thought it would be quite obvious. Like, if you've been playing one of these characters, one of them is probably your favorite.
Yeah.
Um, but I think they got really, oh yeah, Valerie saying, choice scarred me for life. Sorry. I thought people would have a favorite character that they would have in their mind already picked for this person should run the house, and so therefore they are the logical choice. But I think what happened was even better, where most people ended up loving the family as a whole,
Hmm.
and so they were like, I can't choose within my family. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So I was like, okay, yeah, I get that. But
Just a
yeah.
proper Sophie's choice for them
Yeah, I mean, I knew
in
it was
their
gonna be a hard choice,
entertainment.
but like, yeah, I
Yeah.
thought it'd be more strategic, and it was very much like a heartfelt choice for people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that act like that kind of choice is such a good example of player agency. And we talked a little bit about player agency already, but could you explain for the creators what player agency is, and also just any tips for like inexperienced creators who might not have tried to work with player agency, and kind of like what are your tips for a new creator on how to start doing this in their writing?
Yeah, player agency is a game term that we throw around a lot. And it basically means like what is the player allowed to do? In what way can they affect the game or the story? Um, and when we say agency, it means like can they like pick up objects and solve puzzles? Can they drive a relationship one way or another? Can they affect how the game ends? It could be big, it could be small. And so when you're thinking about it, start big and think about like, do I have two endings for my story? Maybe like I don't know, there's the breakup ending and then there's the stay together ending. And you can think, okay, big. So I'm driving the story in these two directions, but then think about going smaller and smaller. So you're like, okay, well, within those things, can I choose, I don't know, like smaller versions of that where, I don't know, maybe things are ending really romantic, or maybe there was a small betrayal at some point, or maybe there was something like that happened that the player had control over where they like made the choice to lie in order to save the person's feelings, but then the person finds out, right? But you gave the player the option to say, I will lie or I won't lie. Um, that doesn't change it like on a top level, but it changes sort of a mid-range thing. And then at the very bottom, you have player agency where, you know, when you're putting up choices of what to say to other characters, like that's agency. So when you think about those choices, don't just think about them in terms of like pick three things to say. Try to pick three things that have somewhat different meanings from each other. So it's like a mean thing versus a compassionate thing versus a sarcastic thing, where it's not just three random things you thought of to say. It's like, no, they have some kind of inherent like meaning so that when the player is choosing them, they feel like I have agency to be sarcastic, or I
Mhm.
have agency to be very compassionate. Um, and you're giving them that, like, again, it's a little bit of control, but like, yeah, agency can be big, it can be small, but you want to be thinking about it every time you're putting something on screen for them to do. Like,
Yeah.
ask yourself, like, what kind of agency am I giving them? What control? What am I allowing them to do?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point for creators who are watching, that like it doesn't have to be the do I save this guy or do I save this guy every time. Like it's so great to have those throughout your story and like really create those core moments where they do influence the story widely. But if you do too much of that, you will hate yourself later because you'll be writing 800 branches. So really think about how you can like actually express personality through these smaller choices. Like it's so true that, you know, even small things as much as like someone offers to buy you a drink in a bar, and the way that you react to that is going to change so much depending on the type of person that you are. So being able to control those actions makes a big difference.
Yeah,
Any other
definitely.
tips for like kind of these an inexperienced creator who might think, well, I totally understand how to write. I wrote a book. Like how what else would you advise for them in terms of moving into interactive?
The Dorian tool will force you to do this, but I would highly encourage you to flowchart your plot out ahead of time. So take the big beats and go like, okay, here's the big beats of what happens in my linear story. And if your flowchart looks like this, you might have a problem. Um, and like you can use Twine or you can use Dorian to sketch out like, or any flowcharting program, but I would say like take your story apart and put it into a flowchart and see if you can get some of that branching. And like Jess said, like don't make everything a do or die choice. You will hate yourself later. You know, try to limit the big choices to some main beats, but the little choices you can offer are also very appreciated by players, especially if they're role playing. And like going back to our beginning of our conversation, I feel like romance is such a great place to have role playing mean something. Like that's like the all of what flirting is about. You're like, how
Yeah.
am I, am I being coy? Am I being like kind of hard to get, or am I like coming on strong or whatever? That's
Yeah.
all agency and that's all cool role playing to do.
Yeah, yeah. Well, another aspect of, I think, writers who come from other forms of media is the world building component. I think
Mhm.
what we see a lot in our creators is like, I have to fight it in my own work, is this desire to Star Wars crawl the beginning of your
Yeah,
game
yeah.
and tell them every detail about the world and stuff like that. So you've worked on so many properties with different types of world building. Like, what are your best tips for making it really easy for people to kind of come into this world and learn the core elements that they need to know? And how do creators understand, like, what do I need to tell people up top versus keeping for later?
My number one thing would be don't have any scenes where one character is explaining the world to another one. Like those are just death, Like if you have to have a scene in like a conference room or somewhere where some character's like, I have to explain to you everything that's happening, just like avoid it. The best way to do that, and you'll see this in like the Lord of the Rings movies. Like I'm a big nerd, so I watch those movies, but like Lord of the Rings movies do a really good job of onboarding a lot of the lore and world building by having the characters travel through the world. So if your characters, if you can get them to be doing something else, like traveling or like, fighting or escaping or doing something like where that's exciting what they're doing. And then in the background, you have like bits of the lore starting to come through. Then you can build your world as they go and as other things are happening. But like their primary focus is like saving their life or saving their friend's life or something like that. That allows you to like sneak in a lot of stuff at a pace that players won't feel like you've turned the fire hose of lore onto them.
I mean, you mentioned earlier too the idea of like putting them into a cold open where it's very like it's a smaller scale thing before. Do you have any other techniques like that that you would suggest for people as they're introducing players to their world?
Yeah, starting small. I mean, that's just the way to go. It's like if you can imagine a scene in your world that has nothing to do with trying to build the lore up, and then imagine like how you would fit the lore in around the edges, that can often be a really good way to onboard it. And also just like be realistic with yourself about like how much of this lore do I need to explain and how much can just sit on my desk or in the back of my mind that you're like it's there and so it's making everything feel real, but I actually don't need to say like 90% of it no one ever needs to know.
Yeah. I mean, I love world building where you can kind of feel it in the texture of the world without knowing exactly. Like you can tell that people are afraid of something, but you don't need to know all the lore about the demon king who's off somewhere in the distance, but you see that people are doing like putting wards by their doors or something like that. So it implies that they are afraid of something.
Yeah.
I feel like you can get a lot of mileage off of those little like texture pieces in your world without of giving me an encyclopedia of things to remember, essentially.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
much, I mean, it's a much like how we live our daily lives in this world. Like we don't explain to each other constantly, like, how did our political system come together? Like we just
Yeah.
say, oh God, another election. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like that stuff just comes out naturally. It's the iceberg approach where you go, 10% of the iceberg's above the water. That's all you really need to sink the
Yeah.
ship. The rest of it, is just for you, to have developed.
Yeah, yeah. So we're gonna open up to questions shortly, but so you guys in the chat, you can start thinking about what kinds of questions you want to ask. But I have another question for Ryan before. So start thinking, start writing your questions. My question for you, Ryan, is Telltale is very well known for having been like a leader in terms of very natural dialogue, really good character development. I just like felt so connected to many, especially Walking Dead. Like I just it was like my emotional connection to these characters was almost like I knew them as real people. And as we're thinking about on Dorian, especially for Dorian Legends, they have the opportunity to pitch, but they have to introduce these characters maybe one or two lines of text. And so can you give your advice on how do people write characters where like in just a couple lines of text, they can exude that personality and tell me so much just in the way that they speak? How would you like recommend they go about writing dialogue that way?
What one of the writers, I mean, this is a common thing, but I remember talking to one of the writers used to say, like, write down the line for some character, what you want them to say. Uh, the first way it comes out of your head, just write it down. Then look at it and write it in a way that you've never seen it before or never heard it before. Like just tweak it slightly. So it's like, if you say, hello, how are you? My name is blah, blah, blah. And then you like flip it up and I don't know how, like off the top of my head, but like, you could take a line like that that's very generic. And it gets the point across. But if you tweak it and go, I'm going to try and say that in a way that I've like never heard before, especially for the introduction to a character, that really helps draw a player reader in where they're like, okay, I know exactly what they're saying, but I've never heard anyone quite say it that way before. And we don't get to use like accents when we're doing something like Dorian or whatever on mobile, especially. You don't get voice recording, so you don't get the benefit of that. So you really do need to lean on like how the text reads and make the text itself kind of interesting and evocative of that character.
Mm. Yeah, we have some of the character sheets actually from the Arcana's original writing, and one of the things that they did was for each character they would have a blurb of like, here's a standard way someone would break up with you, and here's the way this character would break up with you. And they
Right.
wrote the whole breakup in their voice, and that was how they defined the voices. And actually, for those of you guys who are watching, we do have a voice evolution exercise in Dorian Academy where it's actually very similar to what Ryan just described. It's like, here's the standard good morning, but how does this character say good morning? And just the idea that like, if you're an anxious person, you might have a lot of starts and stops in the way that you speak, the way that I do. And then if you're more confident, you might speak a little more differently. So it's a really great tool to use to start to figure out like how does the way that the character feels and presents themselves express itself through their dialogue. Okay, we have a first question from the audience. Are there any major red flags in an opening beat that would make you drop a story or game within the first episode? Interesting question. Trying to get Ryan to be harsh here.
I know, like bad grammar, taking too long to interact with another character. I mean, those would both be red flags. You're like, oh, this person hasn't even proofread their stuff. That's often a bummer. Taking too long to interact. Yeah, pacing is really important. A lot of the stories I've been enjoying are really fast paced, especially at the beginning, like chapter one, chapter two, to get that pacing like as fast as you can. And then you can open it up. And I think like you said the word investment, and I think investment's really important. Like once you're invested and you've like gone through a couple clicks, made a couple choices, spent some hearts, whatever, then you can kind of like let things. And a lot of these stories do, you'll notice like they'll pair you off with one character. Like you'll meet everybody at first and then they'll pair you off with one person. So you get some time to like unfold, and those dialogues can be a little bit longer. But let's see, red flags. Red flags. What other red flags would I have? The other red flag I would have is like coming on too strong. It is a bit of a thing. It's like you don't want to present the player with a life or death decision in like the first two screens, even though it may seem like that's the big like wow factor. You go, they don't know anything about where they are, they don't know anything, and then they're like, kill this puppy, yes or no, and you're like,
Yeah.
okay, that's a great or awful choice or whatever, but like they don't even know anything about who they are or where they are. So that would also be a red flag for me. What about you, Jess?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you in terms of players want that context for the choices that they're making. I encountered it actually in my game Royal Red. I asked them to make a choice about which guy they want to basically spend episode one with on like the first choice, because I was thinking, oh, how great, I'm going to give them so much control. They're going to have all this opportunity to customize this experience. And everyone comments and is like, how am I supposed to make this choice? I don't even know who
Yeah.
these people are. So it's like, it's a very easy mistake to make. But yeah, my personal red flag is definitely like if I'm reading the first 10 lines and you're throwing a lot of like lore words
Mm.
at me and you're like, well, the ancient race of these people. And I'm like, nope, my brain can't, I have no short-term memory. Apparently, I cannot remember all these words. Like, don't make me learn lore words in the first
Yeah.
minute. Yeah.
No, that's for me too. Totally. I'm 100% with you on that. I'm like, what?
Yeah, I know. I was like, I don't want to
Treat me
out
like I'm.
myself as being dumb while reading these
No,
games. I just can't remember any of it. Yeah.
no, I mean, yeah, no, you're clearly not dumb, but like, I feel like treat me, I'll say like, treat me like I'm dumb. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
I don't mind it. Yeah.
Treat me like I have 2 seconds of memory and I'm also about to be distracted by the dog who wants to go out and stuff like that. I
Yeah.
just want to be hooked and I want it to be really served on a platter for me to understand. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. 100% agree
All
on that
right.
one.
We have another question. When you're writing player dialogue, do you have any guidelines for yourself on how nice dialogue should be? How is player response to Bigby on the whole? Who is generally meaner? Oh, good question. That's a great question.
How nice dialogue should be. Do you know what's funny? When I was working at Jam City, they were like, always be nice to the player because this was a real mobile type way to think about things. Like, always be nice to the player and always have every character in the game be nice to the player. And I really disagreed with that. I was like, players don't want someone that doesn't feel real. Don't be mean to the player for no reason, but like definitely have characters like Professor Snape. He's not nice, but he's compelling. And
Yeah.
you're like, you want to know, you get in situations where you want to please that person for your own goals, or maybe because you feel like, if I get to know them and break through the harsh exterior, there is somebody nice on the inside. So, and I feel like that's how it worked with Bigby, where we could have him be quite mean because people sense that also, and we said, I think, he's super lonely. He is very isolated. He has no human connections with anybody. And it's sort of broken his heart, like so if he's mean, it's because there's that going on. So
I wouldn't underestimate also the ability to put a character in who's a little like a jerk that you get to sass back. Because I think in
yeah.
terms of role play, we as people go through our lives having to be very polite to people. And it's really satisfying in role play when you get to say the thing back that you would never say in real life. Like I've noticed that in general on Dorian, especially if it's a romantic rival who's being rude to you and you get to kind of put them in their place. People love doing that. So if you're considering it, you should.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the sass, don't underestimate it.
Yeah. Okay. Piano Bell is asking about going from linear novel style to interactive game style. In more literature, you have to be more descriptive about everything, can get quite flowery in your language. Is there merit to keeping that in these sort of stories, or is it better to keep text straightforward? Great question, Piano. A lot of people ask this. Yeah.
I mean, the nice thing about these games is you have visuals, like every screen can be a picture if you can afford the art, but like
Yeah.
every screen can be a picture that covers all the descriptive text that you might otherwise have to be writing.
Yeah, yeah. I generally would recommend that you try and use more of a approach like a screenplay where it's like the action lines are to tell me things that are happening that I can't tell from the visuals and the dialogue, but anything you can get through dialogue is going to get you there faster. It's interesting though, I would say there's an exception for if you're writing spicy content, because you do need to describe what's happening and the sensations and the tactile feelings of what the character is experiencing. And we also see a lot of strong performance if you write about the way that the other characters expressing their desire for the main character. And I think that's because it's very human to want to feel desired by someone else. And so the people do enjoy reading that description, I would say. Yeah. Let's see. We have another from Piano. Do you have an opinion on the player character being character? This is a really good one. It's a main character being a defined character versus a self-insert kind of blank page character.
Oh yeah, I have strong opinions on this. In fact, I'm just going through this right now with the new story that I'm breaking, where people were like, it the main character in my newest like game is a very specific person because with a specific gender and a specific background, because actually all that is very important to the story, and the story is about like kind of gender dynamics in the world and how people treat each other, rich and poor. And so I really needed that main character to be on the poor end of the scale, and then also male, because that plays against one of the strong characters who's female and is wealthy. And so there's a dynamic that's really important. If that wasn't, I would really love to offer players the chance to be like, yeah, define your own character, like work, decide who you are in this world. But when it really means something to the story, I'm in favor of like saying, no, you're this predetermined character and your POV is actually really important.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that that conflicts with player agency at all? Like, how do you kind of grant them player agency when you're being prescriptive of that kind of element there?
It's actually really interesting, like going back to Bigby, because you can offer them agency to play against where they're coming from. So you're like, here's your backstory. Maybe it's terrible. You're a criminal, you're ex-murderer, you're out on parole. Now you have a whole bunch of like all your choices are informed by like, am I playing into that or am I like playing against it or whatever. So you can still offer a ton of agency that maybe even more interesting because like you said, you get to make choices you wouldn't make in, the real world. You're like, oh,
Yeah.
what do I do with this persona?
I do think that on Dorian, for you guys who are thinking about it, one thing you do want to think about is if you have the defined persona, is it something that's going to be relatable to the kinds of people who are on the platform? So it might be a little harder to sell a game about an 80-year-old man who is going through his retirement or something like that than it is to have a defined character who's a little younger and is, experiencing things that are going to be more relatable for our audience. It's something to consider if you're writing your content.
Yeah, and I love the fantasy fulfillment of some of the Dorian stories where you can kind of like be like, it's me, or it's me, but like I have a different gender or whatever. But like,
So we only have a couple minutes, guys, left. So we have a few more questions. Someone is asking about your writing process when writing branching story paths. And are you thinking about potential choices and following those through, or do you consider different consequences and figure out how to get to those consequences? It's an interesting question.
yeah, very interesting. It for me often starts with the big endings and then I work my way back somewhat. But it can be like growing together, and so like finding each other in the middle, where I kind of know what the beginning is, and I definitely like to have a really good sense of what the ending is, or the endings, I should say. Um, so yeah, and then I'll grow them together. And then, like I mentioned flowcharting earlier, that's a huge part of my writing process when I'm writing um, for games. Like I flowchart everything just to make sure I have enough branching, and if I have too much, if I have not enough, really helps to just have a flowchart.
So I have one last question for you, which is, do you have any final advice for creators who are looking to impress you? Since you are judging Dorian Legends, people will be pitching you directly. Kind of what are you excited to see? What's your advice for these creators on what will really knock your socks off about this?
I, like many people, respond to the emotion of a situation first. So if you can get me in of like, pitch me the emotional, what hooks me, like what gets my heart into it, and then build the world building of the lore around it, and then build the context. But yeah, that's like generally where I look for whether I like a story or not. Is like, do I feel like are my heartstrings being pulled, or is it like interesting on that level and on an emotional level? Can I relate to it? Um, and then yeah, then build the rest around it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so this is like perfect timing. It's 10:59 right now. We've managed to do it all in an hour. Thank you, Ryan, so much for taking the time to talk with all of us. Creators, I hope that you found this really helpful. If you did, you should leave it in the chat on Discord so Ryan can see how much you appreciate him. And I hope everyone's going to be working on your Dorian Legends pitches. You should pitch earlier than later because you're going to have more time to get some feedback in there. And we'll be reviewing all those pitches soon. And I can't wait for Ryan to see all of the amazing games that are going to be worked on as part of our creator fund. Thanks
I'm
so much,
super excited.
Ryan.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. I'm super excited and I can't wait to see what y'all come up with.
awesome. All right, everyone. We'll see you on Discord. Thanks so much. Bye.
Cool.
Happy
All right.
Saturday.
Bye.